and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Brothers, sisters, respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome once again to our series, Life, the Islamic Answer. We were discussing the role of the intellectual in the Islamic community of knowledge. And we began the discussion by looking at some of the major transformations that took place in the world, in both the Western world and the Islamic world, to see that these are transformations that forced the societies in both the Western world and the Islamic world to reconsider a new role, a role that did not exist before, for this person that today we may call the intellectual. And we went through, after a quick exploration of the major milestones that took place on both sides and drawing some parallels, we tried to extract a number of trends. And inshallah, those were clear, which led us to start looking at how the Western world and how the Islamic world actually looked at the role of the intellectual. What have they said about this role? Who is the intellectual, and what role do they play descriptively? What is the role that the intellectual is playing? And beyond the description, at the prescription level, so at the level of what they should be doing, what should be the role of the intellectual in society? In the last discussion that we had, the role of the intellectual started to become a lot clearer based on the works of a number of scholars, a number of thinkers in the West. And we said that it makes sense to start from the West in our study for a number of reasons. The major one being that the West was confronted with the problem of the intellectual and the role of the intellectual much sooner than it happened in the Islamic world. And secondly, as we will see inshallah, there's quite a number of parallels, issues, situations, problems, questions that were dealt with, that were addressed in the West, that are very similar to the ones that we find in the Islamic world. And beyond all of this, we also said that we can't for ourselves, because this is, we hope, to be a relevant, practical discussion that we're having for our own communities. This is not a discussion we're having purely for theoretical reasons. We have to look at our own situation as a community. And we said that as communities, we are not completely separate from the Western world, and we are not completely separate from the Islamic world. The reality in which we live is that we are minorities living in the Western world. And so we need to understand that reality and the developments that led to the reality that we have today. There's a reason why the intellectual is looked at in this manner, specifically in Western society. There are developments that have led to this, and we're not isolated entirely from those, so we have to understand them. And at the same time, we're also not entirely disconnected from the Islamic world, because that is our background. For some of us, we may be first generation or a second or a third, but we certainly still carry the heritage and the background of the Islamic world. And so we need to find a way to look at the entire discussion, see what the Western world has said, the thinkers, the philosophers who have looked at this question of the intellectual in society in the Western world, and then look at what has been said in the Islamic world, and then come up with a synthesis that makes sense for us as communities, minority communities of Muslims living in the West, where all of this converges into us, onto us. So I won't do a full recap Inshallah, we covered a lot and all of it is by now clear. So inshallah, just building on where we stopped the last time that we met, after looking at a number of thinkers and some of their thought, we said that there are three themes that start to become very clear in all of the works that have looked at the role of the intellectual in society. The first one is the role of what we called power structures. So in society, there are what philosophers have referred to as power structures. Power has structures. So of course this is a metaphor. Just like you would talk about buildings or you talk about roads, the notion of power, the more sociologists and philosophers looked at it, the more they came up with they reached the conclusion that it has structures. And if you understand those, then you understand how to gain power in society, how to keep and maintain power, how to create power where there is none, and so on and so forth. And we looked at a few philosophers, a few thinkers that fall in this category of those who have just focused on this idea of power, and from that angle they have looked at the role of the intellectual. So in other words, they have said when we look at power in society and who holds that power, we want to understand what is the role of the intellectual in that society. Are they helping those who already have the power to maintain it? Or are they destabilizing that structure and allowing for those who don't have power to achieve and to gain some of that power? So that was one discussion, that was one theme. It's perhaps a little theoretical, a little abstract, but it has direct relevance to us and our societies and our communities. So we park that for now. That's the first discussion. The second theme, and inshallah this one is a little bit more concrete, has to do with the idea of expertise. If we are talking about the intellectual, we are forced to therefore start talking about those who have expertise in society. This is the technical definition of the intellectual. They are usually people who are highly educated, even though we said this is not how we are using the term. We're using the term in a broader sense of all those who want to get involved in intellectual thought in community, in our communities. We are including them in this definition of the intellectual. That's our purpose. That's where we're trying to go for our own relevant and concrete reality. But if we want to be technical, the term applies more to those who have expertise. And so the second theme, where a lot of thinkers and a lot of philosophers and others who have looked at this idea of the intellectual have focused their energy, is around the idea of expertise. And we looked at a number of scholars, a number of thinkers and philosophers and economists and political thinkers. And we said that one of the things that starts to become clear is that perhaps counterintuitively, they are not all for the role of the expert in society. In fact, we said that a very clear position starts to emerge that many of them, let's say the soft version of this is, they have been very skeptical. They have a skeptical position towards the intellectual in society or towards the expert in society. And those who have been more blunt and they went further in their position, they are outright entirely critical of experts and intellectuals in society. And we already saw a number of examples of this. We spoke about, for instance, Paul Johnson. He's a British historian. He looked at the lives of many intellectuals, public intellectuals throughout history, and he said while they are brilliant people on one side and in certain areas, in other areas where they are not experts, they have come up with ideas and they have shared thoughts with society that were absolutely catastrophic. And that when we look at their own lives, we see that their own lives are filled with contradictories, and that they are not always very consistent in their thought. They don't necessarily live by the same ideals and the same principles that they preach and they present to the world, and so on and so forth. And so for this reason, we have to be careful before glorifying them too much and following them blindly. Then there was another discussion that we looked at, and this one went a little bit further, from Thomas Sowell. We said he's a very prominent American economist. He's an African American, and he has a trilogy of books, 3 books, a series of 3 books, where he talks about the role of intellectuals in society, and specifically in one of his works, a 2010 book called Intellectuals and Society. And in there he was talking about how one of the main issues with intellectuals in society is that there is usually no accountability that they carry for their thoughts. They can come up with any theory, with any model, with any idea, and people exaggerate their reliance on them because they are intellectuals. And as he said, they have a way with words. They understand language very well and how to use it and how to present their ideas in a convincing way. They carry charisma. They are already recognized as authorities in their field. And oftentimes, we give them too much credit. We over-rely on them. We don't look at what they say with a lot of scrutiny. We accept it, whether it is in their field of expertise or not, and they're not accountable. They may come up with a policy, they may come up with an economic system or model or idea or prediction, and people follow, and sometimes with catastrophic consequences, and the intellectual moves on to new ideas and new theories and new models, and nothing changes. And we said this might be going a little too far. It's not always that there are no consequences. The consequences are perhaps of another nature than purely economic, for instance. But he has a point in saying that if this is all they're doing, their output, and this is how he defines intellectuals, is that their output is simply and only at the intellectual level. It's only at the level of ideas. And that's why we said he is one of those who, for instance, exclude engineers. He says engineers are not intellectuals. Why? Because they produce real things in the world, and there are real consequences to what they produce. If the blueprint of a house is faulty, the house will fall. And there will be catastrophic consequences, and they have skin in the game. But an intellectual who comes up with, economic forecasts and projections, and they move on, and people follow those, and they invest money, for instance, and they lose it all, there's perhaps no accountability for that. In any case, so there's a disproportionate influence on public opinion given what they are actually providing in terms of value to society. Society exaggerates its reliance on them, and so on and so forth. And so his focus was always about policy making, running a country, their effect on society, and so on and so forth. But this is something that we should keep in mind as well in our own discussion, in our own communities, and so on and so forth. If we want to take the discussion where many lectures ago we had a full series on, or a mini-series within our larger series on, for instance, the link between knowledge and action. And this is where we can draw the parallels between perhaps those who only talk, who only have ideas, and those who also do. And there's action that has to accompany the knowledge that you carry. In any case, we'll come back to that. As we said, we're only trying to extract trends here, and we'll see what applies later. We said also that another thinker, Albert Camus, he's a French-Algerian philosopher, literary figure. He won the Nobel Prize, and he died at a quite young age. And he wrote fiction, and he wrote non-fiction. And in his existentialist work, in the work where he looks at the meaning of a human being and the meaning of the life of a human being and so on and so forth, in one of his works, it's called L'Homme Révolté, The Revolting Man. In that work, he is specifically looking at how people blindly follow intellectuals and how initially the ideas and ideals of intellectuals may seem very lofty, but they may also go too far to the point where they dehumanize people and call them to violence and do things that go against the same principles they're supposed to be preaching and teaching, and people will continue to follow them. And so this is more from a fiction or more from a literary standpoint, but these works were very influential in that society at that time. And of course, a lot of this was in reaction to communism and Marxism and so on and so forth, but they were considered very serious discussions on the role of the intellectual in society and how we have to be very careful in society. Who do we follow and who do we allow to take so much space and have so much influence in society? Again, things to keep in mind for ourselves when we come to our own communities. So we are at the point where we're simply trying to close off this second theme. We said the first theme was power structures. The second one has to do with the role of the expert. So we said the first one that we wanted to look at within that theme is those who are skeptical or who are critical of the experts and of intellectuals in society. And here were some examples. We want to continue with this discussion, inshallah, we'll wrap it up today, by looking at a couple of nuances in there, and I'll try to focus on some books because some people are asking for references, resources that they can consult, and a lot of these are now available, easily available, if you're interested in this type of discussion. So if we want to complete the same discussion of the skeptical or the critical position of those towards intellectuals and towards experts, we said there's the direct critique of experts, and then there is the softer approach. So in terms of direct critique, I want to start with a book that appeared in 2014. It was called The Tyranny of Expertise. The Tyranny of Expertise, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor by William Easterly. So in this book, the author focuses on a number of studies, all of them in developing countries. He looks at the state of developing countries and where experts have come in, proposed models, the models were implemented, and then you look at the results, and the results were not very good. For all sorts of reasons, political, human rights, socio-economic, which was the main focus, at least if that dimension, which was the main dimension we're trying to improve, improved at a cost, then at least we say a part of it worked. But even in that respect, it did not work. And so he said that these experts and their specialized knowledge was not able to effectively solve complex and social problems. The reliance on experts who came in and tried to solve these problems failed. So his main arguments, the first one is a critique of what we call technocracy. So technocracy is the way you rule a society by relying on the experts, right? Technocracy. And at some point, different points in history, it became a very popular idea and it became a very unpopular idea. And then there are a lot of works that appeared during those times that led to, the utopic society, the perfect society, the utopia. What would a perfect society look like? And so many thought it would be a society run by technocrats, the experts. And a lot of them would be kind of engineers, those thinkers who understand science and logic and very linear. So there was a wave of that, and then there's a counter wave of those thinkers who completely oppose this. And they said this is going to be a dystopic society. It's going to be hell, as they said. You're going to create hell on earth because you're giving full power to those people who are going to rule with an iron fist. They will become dictators who rule in a way that no one else is allowed to think and criticize. And this is the whole discussion around technocracy, and it can go very far, so I'll stop it here. But this is the idea. So he goes back to saying, first, there's a critique of technocracy. He says that Usually technocrats are people who lack real-world experience. They rely on theories. They rely on abstract models. They rely on ideas that they have studied, that they have created in their minds, and they think this is the perfect model that will solve all these problems. It hasn't really been put to the test. Or if it has been, maybe it has been put to a very limited test. Hasn't been applied in this specific situation, and he's going to come to that. So he says they prioritize theory over experience of individuals in society. And that's always a danger. Real life is always more complicated than the lofty principles and ideas. Then he talks about real cases. Whenever we look at these societies in the developing world, where there is success is where there has been input and leadership that was bottom up. It came directly from the people themselves living in the situation. And in these cases, we are trying to propose top-down solutions. Solutions that are coming from experts who know better than you. What do you know? You are living in this situation and you haven't been able to get yourself out of it. So someone who is superior from the top is going to come from the outside and teach you how to do it. Whereas the real solutions have to be bottom up. They have to come from those communities or those societies themselves. So all ideas to keep in mind. The importance of accountability. And he talks about it in his book. And he says, once again, the experts who came in, they were not accountable. They proposed their models failed, and they moved on. Nothing happens. And they moved on to try to implement the same model elsewhere, only to see it fail again. And finally, we have to prioritize local solutions, bottom-up solutions, and creativity and innovation and so on and so forth that comes from the local population. That's the idea of that book. That's one book, The Tyranny of Expertise. Another book that talks directly in a way that is critical of experts is called The Price of Panic. And there's a lot of books that appeared at about the same time with the same theme, with the same ideas as this one. And this is, if I continue with the title or the subtitle, it becomes clear. The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe, by Richard Lindzen and many others. It's a collective work. And so in this work, they focused initially on the management of COVID-19 in society. And the main idea behind it was that this is a catastrophe that was mismanaged. Something did happen. It required to be handled. It required management. But the management was completely wrong, mainly because, and they focus on two things, over-reliance on experts, one, and groupthink. And I'm going to come back to groupthink a little bit later. And so they are saying that all of this led to creating unnecessary panics and poor decision-making. So they critique over-reliance on narrow expertise. The catastrophe looked like it was directly related to a specific field. So they took people who are highly specialized in one tiny field, a very narrow field. And whatever said went for every other dimension of life because of that angle, when that may or may not have been appropriate. For instance, let's say epidemiologists, for instance. And there could be others. Right? So they talk about this. So they say there was a flawed consensus among a very small group who lack broader perspective. Those people are just focused on their studies and what they know in one very small, very specialized field. But that became generalized to every dimension of life. It trumped everything else. And then you add to that, and this is your groupthink, media influence and public perception. So the media amplified all of this, and then it gave people a one-directional way of thinking that matches the narrow views that came from a very select, very small group of people. So they say everything was sensationalized through the media, which amplified and exaggerated claims, focused on some things while ignoring others, stifled real rational discussion, didn't allow for critical evaluation of data, and any dissenting voices were silenced. And this is the situation that you get. So after the fact, when you look at it, you would say there was mismanagement. This is not how it should have been managed. So these are two examples where, of course, the idea is not to talk about COVID, or as we said, it's not about these specific arguments. It's to look at how the arguments are applied and to what extent they can be relevant to what we're trying to do. So now we are still within skeptical, critical, but now the critique is a little bit more indirect. So I wanted to present two different cases where expertise is being criticized, but now from a different angle. We're not simply saying we are against critique, we are against expertise, we are against the intellectual, as we saw in those cases. So in the first case, we're going to see the tension between generalist knowledge versus expert knowledge. Should we be relying more and creating societies and education systems and career paths that are built on expertise? You specialize as early as possible and you remain in that path and you go deeper and deeper in your expertise and your specialization? Or should we be creating models of society, of education systems, and rewarding a more generalist approach where you are exposed to much more and you may specialize later, but that happens only later, and you may never really truly specialize. So the idea here is not that it is against expertise, even though there is a hint of a critique of expertise, but it's indirect. The idea is that how early do you want to specialize? And it goes against a very well-known, well-established idea now that all those who reach success very quickly in life specialized very early and practiced very early. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so that's one way, one indirect critique of expertise that we'll look at in one book. And then the second one has to do, again, it's not a direct attack against expertise, but the idea of the individual versus the collective. To what extent should we be still relying on an individual, no matter how much of an expert they are, versus the collective intelligence that we get when we put many brains together, even though they may not be specialists, even though they may not be experts? Where should we be looking for solutions to complex problems of life? By going to the one specialist, an expert, or going to the many who are willing to contribute even though they may not be the experts? Or perhaps there may be experts within them, even though they may not be at that level of expertise. So the first idea was the critique based on the generalist versus specialist. So the book is called Range. It appeared in 2019. Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. The author is David Epstein. In that book, the author starts to talk about the idea of being a generalist, or starting your life as a generalist and remaining a generalist for a considerable portion of your life, so that you have time to start being exposed to a lot of things and experience a lot of things before specializing and going very far in your specialization. And this counters the popular notion that early specialization and narrow focus are what lead to true success. So his focus is very anecdotal. He just looks at case after case of very successful people in history. And he looks at different fields, business and sports and music and education and so on and so forth. And so he provides cases and he presents studies around this idea of success and how success is supposedly achieved. And he shows that in many fields, the generalists, those who have a broad set of skills and a lot of interests, were more adaptable, creative, and ultimately more successful than the specialists who focused on a very narrow field, very narrow area. So he does that by focusing on maybe four main ideas. The first one has to do with the value of diverse experiences and delayed specialization. So there's an idea that is well known, and we've even talked about it here, anecdotally, and there are some studies about it, that in order to achieve mastery in a field, or some people call it genius, to become fully masterful in anything in life, you need what? 10,000 hours of practice. Those people are not better than you. They have simply practiced in a more intense, more focused way. So whoever gets to the 10,000 hours of real practice, intense practice, focused practice, is going to achieve that level of mastery. So if you start earlier, when you're 2 and 3 years old, and you achieve your 10,000 hours, by the time you're 10, or by the time you're 11 or 12, of course the world will consider you a prodigy, as opposed to someone else who may start this when they are 40 years old. Correct? But both are going through a similar journey. Generally speaking, that's the theory. So he's questioning this idea here. Why? He's not really questioning the 10,000 hours. He's saying we need to look at it in a little bit more depth. We need to add nuance to this. The truth is, and there's more studies, but people don't go to the studies that go into the details, that the earlier you start, the sooner you will get there. And in a lot of cases, it is true. And this applies to, and he shows studies from music, sports, education. He says that if we look at the studies, there are those who begin early and those who begin late. And it's true that those who begin earlier achieve success faster. So for instance, if we look at business, they may make more money sooner. But that shouldn't be all we look at. The study shouldn't stop there. The study should be overall in life. What else happens? And what else happens is that those who are coming later, not only do they catch up, not only do they bridge the gap, but oftentimes they go further. And there's a reason for this, and this is what he tries to theorize here. He says, for instance, so they achieve a higher income earlier, but that gap is closed later, 1. And 2, those people who got there a lot sooner than others, in a lot of cases, not to say most cases, they quit a lot earlier too. And now they want to experience something different. Whereas those who are generalists, they have already experienced a lot and they got there. It's almost as though it is much more by choice. And so they are happier with what is happening now, and they can sustain themselves and persevere and show more resilience in that situation for much longer. And he's going to come back to this point from another angle. But that's one. There's kind of a psychological resilience that comes with the journey that got you there. So he talks about this. He says often they quit and they change field or they change direction or they change career when they get there too soon, whereas the late specializers persist and keep building on what they already have. Early starters and specializers, they fizzle out most of the time. So there's something that runs out. There was too much sustained energy too quickly, too early, and they run out of that. More than that, the argument is that those people who come later, generalists, who experienced more, they are happier because now, based on what they are doing it because they had a chance to experience more things. And he looks at those who are considered geniuses in their field, a lot of Nobel laureates, for instance, when they study their lives, they see that many of them are not as much falling in that category of true experts as in they are one-dimensional. Many of them, not to say most of them, those that he mentions, they have at least one, if not more, he refers to them as hobbies and interests. I'm going to use another term because in a lot of cases they actually have areas of expertise beyond the field that they are known for. They might be experts at gardening, but no one knows that. Not amateur, truly experts, but they're known for chemistry. They're known for physics. They might be amazing athletes. They might be huge historians, but this is not the field that they're known for. So we're just focused on one area and we say, how did you achieve that? But we don't focus on the other areas to start seeing that they are to a large extent generalists who then specialize in an area, as opposed to having been a one-dimensional human being who was always in just one field doing one thing their whole life. That's what he's trying to show. And this is an important point because a lot of what we read and a lot of what we think about when it comes to intellectuals, it is as though they have to be one-dimensional, as though they have to have an expertise or an interest or a hobby or a knowledge in only one area. This is something that we're going to need later when we talk about Islamically. What does it mean? And for our communities. The second point he talks about is what he calls the kind versus the wicked learning environment. This is a very interesting idea. He didn't create that. He took that from psychologists who talk about, education and how to train human beings for life and educate human beings for life. There's the idea called a kind learning environment or a wicked learning environment. They say a kind learning environment, and so the examples, the applications of it are, for instance, chess and golf. They say there are people who achieve amazing results at a very young age, let's say playing chess or playing golf. But these are what they refer to as kind learning environments. Why? Because it's a closed system with very clear rules, that is very logical, that has no ambiguity, that is black and white. Everybody understands that if you do this, this is the exact result of that. All you need to do is keep practicing and understanding those rules and the causes and effects and applying them. This is a kind learning environment. A wicked learning environment is an environment that is much more ambiguous. And so you might do something and this time it works. The next time you do the exact same thing, it doesn't work. It gives you a completely different result. Why? For instance, because you're dealing with human beings. Now, the same human being, yesterday they were happy when you dealt with them, and today they're sad, or they're hungry, or they're exhausted, and the reaction you get out of them is completely different. This is no longer the same level of linear logic that you find in a game of golf or a game of chess, for instance, where the rules are very clear. And so he links this type of background with, so he wants to show that it is perhaps not the most appropriate thing to do to take cases of people who are considered geniuses or prodigies in something like golf or chess to say this is success in life. Because life is much more closely associated with wicked learning environments. And what society needs, and this is the point he's trying to make, what people need in their lives in general, because real life is much closer to the wicked learning environment, and what society needs is much closer to the wicked learning environment, is not necessarily people who are prodigies in golf and chess. This is not as generalizable to other areas of life as we might think. There are other things that are more generalizable, more transferable, that we can use better as individuals in our lives and society. For society to progress and to say we have more of these people. And so he talks about all of this and gives the examples, for instance, of real world problems in fields like healthcare or education or innovation. They all fall within the wicked learning field or wicked learning that is required, where narrow expertise might limit creative problem solving. Because you think that there's only one way of doing it and you're going to find that one way of doing it. You've been trained to think that way, to act that way, to react that way. Generalists, therefore, he says, are often much better suited for these roles because they are accustomed to seeing problems from various perspectives. Next point, the power of analogical thinking, so that you create analogies in your mind from one type of situation that you have in front of you to something that may seem completely unrelated, but this is where you draw your solution. So generalists, and he shows this with many cases, are better at making connections across disciplines. They don't stay within the one discipline that they know well, leading to breakthroughs in innovation and creativity. And so he talks about engineers, and he gives cases of engineers, of scientists who draw solutions to the problems they're facing and they're dealing with from art or from biology or from music, a notion that seems completely unrelated, but there's something in there that they can borrow and use. But this is only possible because they have a very strong generalist background. They were exposed to all those other fields, and they can draw from them, as opposed to the purist who remains narrowly focused in their field, trying to find a solution from within that field. And then he talks about a study, a 20-year-long study, on geopolitical forecasters. These are people who are usually paid very well by states or think tanks or research institutes to forecast, to explain where the world is going. Geopolitical. What is going to happen in this area of the world, and how is it going to have impacts on these states, and what will happen in the next 20 or 50 years, and so therefore how do we plan ahead, strategically position ourselves as a country, and so on and so forth. So there are people who are supposed to look at a lot of information, perhaps more information than anyone else. And usually they are specialists in more than one field. And they refer to them as geopolitical forecasters or other titles. So he says there was a 20-year study that followed these geopolitical forecasters, and those who were the greatest experts in that field, they are also the ones who got the models and forecasts most wrong most of the time. And, he added, and some got worse with accumulated credentials and experience. Whereas the better forecasters, they're all bright people. They are all people who would get very high ranks on an IQ test, for instance. But the forecasters who had forecasts that were less mistaken, with less errors in them, seemed more accurate, had wide-ranging interests. And other studies on the most successful, this is completely unrelated, studies on the most successful comics, those who write comic books. There were studies done on them to see those who sell the most. People want to buy their comic books more than others. What is their background? Are they those who grew up and became specialists in comic books? And they found out that usually it was those who were exposed to many more genres, many more types of works. And they were not limited to just comic books. And that gave them a lot more breadth and allowed them to create much more diversity in their works and make their works a lot more interesting for people to want to buy them and read them. The last point that he makes is the importance of experimentation and learning through trial and error. And again, he says generalists, because of their life experience and what they've been exposed to, they become more comfortable with failure in order to learn. They know that sometimes you have to fail in order to learn, and then you come back and try it again and you succeed. And so this means that they are more resilient later and better at problem solving, as opposed to the ones who narrowly think that there is one way to do it, and if I practice enough, I will get that way done right, and that's how I will achieve the solution, when that's not always the case. So those who are generalists tend to follow this path of you explore, you fail, and then you learn from it, and then you adapt. And you can reach a better solution faster than the one who is not open to this way of, kind of iterative way of reaching a solution. And the conclusion from all of this is that he wants to apply all of this to today's world. And he says in today's world, breadth matters in a very rapidly changing world. It no longer works. Perhaps there was a time when expertise could have been better. But in today's world, where the world is changing very quickly, he says experts tend to cling to outdated ideas, and they don't want to leave their truth behind because they've been expertly trained to follow a truth, and that's the truth that needs to be followed. And so they become unable to adapt, and others will adapt faster, unable to modernize, or he calls it entrenchment. They become entrenched in their own ways of thinking and ways of doing. And this doesn't work in today's fast-changing world, where we need a lot more flexibility. We need a lot more interdisciplinary approaches to education, to career development, which will be better for the individual in their own life and better for that society that has these types of individuals in them. So I thought there's a lot of very interesting ideas in there. So including the idea that there is a lot of benefit to at least be a generalist first, and to be exposed to as much as possible first before specializing, if specialization is truly needed in the way that perhaps some understand it. And secondly, the idea that it is possible to specialize in multiple areas and multiple fields, and perhaps this is exactly what is required. You can seem like you're a generalist, but your level of knowledge in the multiple fields that you have is still higher than someone else who might be a specialist in that one area, right? So we have to be using those terms in a relative way. We have to define them a little bit better. What do we really mean by a generalist versus a specialist? The indirect critique of experts. I'll start going a little bit faster here, but there's a few names of books I wanted to mention, so I won't spend so much time on the books unless there's a lot of interest. So we continue with the indirect critique of experts. We said first, there's a tension between generalist and specialist. The second tension is between the individual and the collective. To what extent do we rely on someone who is an expert versus we rely on many brains put together trying to solve issues? Okay, that comes through in a lot of works. So there's a work that really focused on this. It's called The Knowledge Illusion: Why We Never Think Alone by Sloman and Fernbach. So this is a 2017 book, but I'm going to link it to other books too, because there's a lot of what is in that book that has been said in different ways. The ideas, the core ideas are in many, much older books, but they've put it together in a new way. So the core argument of the book is about how, as individuals, in truth, if you really think about it, we are truly very ignorant. And we know a lot less than we think we know. It's just that we live in a society where we have found a way to leverage so much of the brains of others and the intelligence of others and the wisdom and the knowledge of others into our lives that we don't even think about it twice. And so they give a lot of examples, and they say, so as individuals, we are very ignorant and not that bright on our own, each one of us on their own. Collectively, we are wise and we are smart, and collectively we are good at moving forward and progressing and innovating. So in order to do what we do and to use our intelligence, we usually have to rely on the intelligence of others much more than we think. That's one idea. We often assume that we know much more than we actually do, from very simple things to very complex systems and processes. But really, none of us really know that much with certainty, and we must rely on others and their intelligence and their knowledge for pretty much every aspect of our lives. And so some of the main ideas, the illusion they call of explanatory depth. We tend to think that we understand how things work, and if we were to be truly asked to explain how those things work, we often struggle to provide a detailed, accurate explanation. We don't really have what they call explanatory depth. We can't go very far in explaining how something works. If we were questioned, we wouldn't be able to. And we can do a test, and they mentioned, by the way, they say most people, we all use pens, and pens are supposed to be very simple. Most people don't know how a pen works. Most people don't know how a toilet works. But we take it all for granted. It seems so simple. We all use it. It's there, everybody. But the truth is, we are relying on someone else's thinking and knowledge and expertise for every little aspect of our lives. And perhaps we may have expertise in some ways and contribute in some ways. Most people don't even do that, right? So this is where we have to appreciate the collective intelligence that we benefit from. The communal nature of intelligence, so now they talk about how human intelligence is not an individual attribute. We rely heavily on the knowledge and expertise of others to understand the world. Third point is the role of language, and how basically language has enough fuzziness and ambiguity that we can get away with giving the impression that we understand how the world works and that we have knowledge, but that's only because we use language in a very fuzzy way and in a very ambiguous way and not in a very, detailed way. Otherwise, it would expose us that we don't really fully grasp much of what we talk about, and therefore the importance of humility. All of this, of course, is to come back to our community discussion. Recognizing the limits of our individual knowledge is crucial for effective learning and problem solving. So the book is challenging the traditional view of this lone genius who is capable of reaching a level of expertise so great that everybody should listen to them. And really, we have to be very objective in thinking, how much expertise do they truly have, and in how many areas in life? How far can that expertise go? When in every other minor and major part of their lives, they actually rely on the expertise of others and the intelligence of others and the knowledge of others. So whatever they come up with is most likely something very limited, with a lot of ifs and a lot of conditions and a lot of context that they don't fully even understand as an intellectual and as an expert, because they have to rely on others, right? And so they challenge that traditional view. They emphasize the importance of collaboration and shared knowledge. By understanding the limitations of our individual knowledge, we become better learners, better communicators, and better problem solvers. And therefore, and that to me was the punchline that I wanted from the book, therefore the importance of recognizing and appreciating the importance of community. That you understand that you are part of a community, that you are truly benefiting. You belong to a community, you're benefiting from what that community produces, and you should therefore find ways to contribute back to that community, because in truth you depend on that community for everything, even if you are an expert. And this is all, to me, in the same line as many very famous works that have appeared, especially in the last perhaps 20, 25 years. Many works have appeared, all of them in praise of, I'm going to call it collective intelligence. The idea that we are much better when we put all of our brains together, and the more we can open and the more we can make those relationships easier to happen, create a platform, create a space, make it easy for people to contribute and to share, then they will learn from each other and things will happen. Amazing things will happen. That's the idea from all of these works. So I thought I'd mention, inshallah, many of these. I think they're just a reminder. Otherwise, they're very famous books. So I thought I'd at least mention those. If they're not famous and you don't know about them, they're worth looking into, even though I think a lot of them are becoming outdated because of the examples they gave. And a lot of this, of course, had to do with the emergence of the internet. Okay? That was making a lot of things suddenly possible that seemed only possible in a fictional world, in a utopic world. And now suddenly, because of the internet, things were becoming a lot more possible. So you saw a lot of these ideas and therefore a lot of these books start to appear. One of them is called, the guy who wrote it, his name is Pierre Lévy. He's a communications professor. He sat on my PhD defense, so I know him well and I know his books well. It's called Collective Intelligence, Mankind's Emerging World in Cyberspace. It's a translation of the French version of the book. That book appeared in 1994. So he was talking about what the potential of the internet can be in 1994, about things that would only happen much later. Right? There was no Wikipedia at that time. There was no YouTube and people sharing as they do today and learning from each other freely and openly as they do today, for instance, through social media at that time in 1994. But the way he writes is a little bit more philosophical, a little bit more abstract, and there is mathematical models behind how knowledge can be shared, and he's still working in that same field. Okay, but he was writing about this. So Wikipedia appeared in 2001. YouTube appeared in 2005. He was writing about this in 1994. Okay, so this was considered very pioneering at his time. How knowledge must therefore be produced collectively, openly, through shared platforms where everyone can contribute and benefit. And so in his idea, there has to be a leveraging of the potential of the internet for it to become the collective mind of all of humanity. This is how he was talking. He's saying, so we have to start applying this to specific problems, and with time we'll see where this is going to take us. But just open it and allow people to share and to contribute. And so all of this he brings back to the idea of a community. And this only works because you belong to a community where you are sharing and you are benefiting from what is being shared by others. Okay, so that's one book. The second book is called Smart Mobs. As I said, there's a general theme here. It's all about the collective mind. So do we go for the lone expert, or do we go for the group of people working together? The second book was Smart Mobs. So 2002, Smart Mobs, the next social revolution. So in that work, they were already talking about the power of mobile devices, smart mobile devices that people carry on themselves, and that can be greatly beneficial in allowing human beings to start sharing knowledge with each other. Okay, so the power of working together, and then they give examples at that time, and today it's well known and it's all in all the news. For instance, one of the examples they talk about is how easy it would be for people to come together to protest for a cause, right? By using the internet and using these devices and so on and so forth, or to respond to emergencies and so on and so forth. And they already started to talk about how society now has to change to allow for new social norms. So they focused, for instance, on privacy. They said for all of this to happen, we have to start changing how we think about privacy and be a little bit more open, because now you are sharing a part of you with the world, and others are sharing a part of themselves with you. And so you have to be open to that if you're going down that path where you're openly sharing a lot more with each other, so the world becomes a lot less private, and this creates issues of data privacy, transparency, and decision-making, and all of that. The next book, very famous book, called The Wisdom of Crowds. This book appeared in 2005, and the whole book is just about the idea where people have to come together to work, and if they do, they perform a lot better than experts do alone. Okay, and then a lot of studies have come up since then to continue this work. But the work is The Wisdom of Crowds, and then the subtitle, Why the Many Are Smarter Than the Few, and How Collective Wisdom Shapes Business, Economies, Societies, and Nations. And so they say the diversity of opinions and the diversity of perspectives that come together to try to solve a problem is usually a lot more powerful than expert decisions. Even though the experts are truly experts, if you are truly able to gain a large breadth of diverse perspectives and ideas from people, it will always be more accurate and go further in the solution than to go with a lone expert. That's one. But then this is where usually people stop. So at least in that work, they gave the condition for that. There's a bias, and we're going to talk about it, which is groupthink. So long as people don't fall in groupthink, so long as I am not relying on you, because now I know we're all in this together and we're all trying to solve this problem, human beings tend to rely on each other. So I won't think anymore, because this is no longer my problem, it's our problem. So I'll wait for you to take leadership and initiative, and whoever says something, I'll probably say, yes, that's the right thing, let's just go with that. Or for whatever reason, and I'll talk about groupthink in a second. So for whatever reason, If something prevents me from truly sharing what I think about or what I can contribute to the problem, and you independently sharing what you truly think about the problem, and then we put it all together, if this is not how it's happening, then we fall into groupthink. And the conditions are not right for the collective intelligence to come together. There can't be anything preventing us from truly thinking independently than putting it all together. So what they are pushing for is for everyone to maintain their autonomy and independence of thought and then putting it all together. And that's different than all of us coming together and working together, because that's when you fall into groupthink. And we're going to talk about groupthink in a second. So that's a bias. For those who have read Thinking Fast and Slow, they talk about this too. It's all the biases. It's a very well-known book as well, in any case. And so there's a lot of cases presented in that book to show how decentralized decisions produce higher levels of accuracy when the decisions are aggregated back together afterwards. But that's what they focus on, because otherwise you fall into groupthink bias. And then people are no longer independently thinking, and you don't really have the full intelligence of everyone contributing to the problem. The next book, 2006, Wikinomics. Dan Tapscott, it became a whole industry since he released that book, Wikinomics, How Mass Collaboration Changes Everything. And so he focuses in there a lot of the same ideas. We must leverage the power of the collective and encourage open collaboration. And this is the main idea that was not really addressed too much before, is that we have to therefore, once again, I think relevant for our communities, we have to rethink the hierarchy of a society or of a business if you truly want to be open and to leverage the networks, which is ideas, by the way, that came from sociology, but these are popular works. They're not the elite works or the academic works. In academic works, this came before, the same idea, and how societies move to networked societies, but what does that mean? So in part, it also means that you flatten. That's why there's books called, The World is Flat, for instance. The world is flat as in you flatten the hierarchy of society. You no longer have to respect, the 72 layers of leadership over you to get to talk to the top boss, for instance. Because now you are part of a networked society where any node, any point in that network can communicate with any other. If you truly believe in open, transparent society, that hierarchy has to collapse and become a lot more flat so that you can truly leverage the idea of people sharing with each other and learning from each other. Otherwise, it's always one way, and it always comes through a very large, complex, slow, burdensome bureaucracy, however you want to call that, administration, layers of hierarchy that will prevent the sharing of knowledge and the learning from each other and so on and so forth. Right? So that was the main idea from that book. And then they also add that we are now, if we want to leverage all of this, it is very easy to go fully global. The scale is no longer my little business or my little community or my little city. You can truly go very global if you truly want to leverage this way of sharing and learning from others. The whole planet is now a click away. You can learn and you can share. And so imagine the power of leveraging all of Earth's collective intelligence if you truly know how to do it and apply these principles, as they say in that book. And this continued. So you saw I intentionally mentioned the books that were most popular around this. So all of them were really around the time when the internet was coming together with a lot more functionality in every home, on every device, on then smart devices, and then you add social media to it and so on and so forth. And this has continued to, in 2020, there was another famous book that came out called The Power of Us, How We Connect to Act and Innovate Together by David Price. So here he talks simply about collective intelligence that works when people are united by, and that was the punchline for me in that book, people are united by a common goal. There's something that gives them meaning and motivation that they all agree on, and this is why they want to participate in something like this. even though this is questionable from a market point of view. In any case, this is very useful for us from a Islamic community of knowledge point of view. So we keep that in mind. Now, I thought that I would at least finish this discussion with the other side to make it balanced. So now we talked about those who say the manner in which we resolve complex issues in the world, for instance, is by reliance on the collective mind. Right? So we're not going to rely on the lone expert. So it's a critique, an indirect critique of the lone expert, a critique of expertise, a critique of the intellectual as an individual. They're not as valuable as some have wanted them to be, and so on and so forth. This is 100% in opposition to the other extreme, which says no, this is going completely in the wrong way, where we rely on the masses. What do the masses know? The masses are too ignorant. The masses are full of biases. The masses don't know anything from anything. They are not experts. We should rely on the experts, and they are the ones who make the big decisions. And if we follow the masses, it will only lead to catastrophe. And by the way, historically, this has been the trend. The major thinkers, major philosophers who have thought about these have always said, you do not listen to the masses. You read Plato and others, they say stay away from the masses. Focus on the elites. Focus on quality, not quantity. The masses don't know where they want to go. They will lead you completely astray. They will lead you in a completely wrong place. Don't give them that much space. Tell them where to go and get them to go there one way or another. They don't know what's good for them. So there's a whole literature around this. And the truth is, you will find a lot more of it in older times. The current trend, even though now, I will openly say, since Trump and COVID, there is now a return to that tendency. To say it's not good to just follow the popular opinion and to listen to the masses and to be blindly part of the masses and. We have to go back to the experts. But over the last 2 decades or so, as we saw, the general trend has been, it's all about collaboration. It's all about the mass working together. It's all about the collective mind, right? Those are the works that we looked at. If you go back a little bit further in history, and then for a long time, no, this is going completely against what we find, historically speaking, all the way to about the emergence of the internet. It was always very critical of the masses, critical of the collective mind, and in praise of the expert, and in praise of the intellectual. Okay, so a few works in that line, and inshallah in the future we'll talk about some of these. One of them in 1841, these are very famous works. In 1841 by Charles Mackay, he wrote a book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. By the way, there are a few books that have appeared recently called Madness of Crowds or something of those lines. It's because it's part of that same line and same heritage. Okay? And the cases that are described are the same. It's when you look at them from the outside or they are presented in a certain way, it's difficult to believe that human beings as a society, we accept this type of behavior. But then because you are in it, you just take it for granted that this is the norm. There's nothing wrong with this. Right? And so 3 volumes when Charles wrote this one, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. 1896, Gustave Le Bon, so he was a polymath, he was an expert in many, many areas, and he spent a lot of time on this idea of the psychology of the crowd. How do human beings think when they are in a group of people as opposed to when they are alone? Okay, he spent a lot of time on this, Gustave Le Bon, and 1896 he released The Crowd, a Study of the Popular Mind, which is different than the individual mind. Popular as in made of the populace, made of a group of people. A study of he wrote in French, by the way, this is a translation. 1932, The Revolt of the Masses. Same idea. What happens when people just come together, and does it necessarily mean that it's a good thing that is happening in this way? In 1982, a book called Groupthink, which is what we talked about, Groupthink, Psychological Studies of Policy Decisions and Fiascos. 1985, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business by Neil Postman. And you can tell where this is going. And I'm going to summarize what comes out of these. So in addition to, please noticing the timeline, when do these appear and why, what's happening in society, it's always in reaction to something. The main arguments here from all of these works is that when human beings come together as a group, they tend to behave in a non-rational, in an irrational manner, and the individuals lose their rational judgment. You no longer think in a rational way. If you were alone and you were thinking all alone about the same topic, the same issue, if it were to be described to you, you would not be behaving or thinking in that same way, generally speaking. 1. 2, what they call economic and social bubbles. Because you are part of a closed system, if it happens to be a closed system, so you're not being exposed to a lot of thoughts and ideas and alternative views in your world. People feed off each other in that world, in that bubble. So it could be an economic one, it could be a social one. And because they continue to feed off each other and they're not exposed to anything else, they all tend to behave in the same way at the end. That's the idea. And of course here, there's a notion that was introduced a couple of centuries ago, but it has remained. It's called psychological contagion. It's just like a disease or a virus that spreads, that human beings are affected by the emotions of others. You take them on. So emotions and moods and attitudes at the psychological level of human beings, they are contagious. They move and they spread in crowds. So the more you bring people together as a crowd, the more these things spread and they remain there. And if there is nothing that allows this to leave, or you're exposed to it and you're immune therefore to something different, then this becomes your reality. The next point, or the next argument, is that they talk about loss of individuality or loss of critical thinking in crowds. When you're in a crowd, you lose yourself as an individual. You blend in. You become conformist. You conform to what is expected of you in that group, and so on and so forth. And then you leave your critical thinking behind. And this is related to the next point. So there is in the human being an instinctive desire to conform, to blend in, to fit in with others, one, and to avoid conflict, and to avoid confrontation, and to avoid standing out. Okay, so this could lead to, and that's exactly what happens, and many have written books about this, to situations where you no longer have dissent. You no longer have anyone who stands up against what is happening, because everybody wants to conform and no one wants to create conflict and create disagreement and so on and so forth. So no more critical voices, no more critical thinking. And it becomes a lot easier, because it becomes a cycle, it becomes a lot easier to silence or to suppress opposing views. Because you're in a crowd. Because everyone is trying to conform and no one wants to stand out. And then you add into this, so these are the main arguments of those who wrote these books. I put them all together. One is the influence of leaders and those who want to manipulate all of this. And so they could be, in a lot of cases, the experts, whether they are political or, economic or religious or others. This is where those who have influence in society can come in and take advantage of this groupthink, take advantage of these human beings who are in a crowd. Many of them don't want to stand out. Many of them want to conform. This is when those people can come in and manipulate or get what they want out of that group, or get them to go where they want to go, or act in the way that they want. And we talked about this. Sowell talks about it and others. And then, and that was the entire title of one of the works, that generally speaking, for instance, crowds love entertainment. love to be entertained. And this is a whole discussion that, generally speaking, crowds and masses are not that interested in depth and in substance and in things that are serious. They want to be entertained, because now you're working with the lowest common denominator, what is common to all of them. You're not working with those who have the stamina and the seriousness and the perseverance to sit and think and be real in their accuracy, in their precision, in their objectivity, and how they look at things. This is not going to be your masses, right? And so you dilute. And this is where you have the next one, which is the decline of rational discourse, the decline of depth, because you're catering to the masses, the promotion of mediocre standards. And that's why in recent years, one bestseller was Mediocrity, right? There was a book called Mediocrity that came out, and it's all about how standards and everything are just going down. What used to be unacceptable before as a standard is now the norm. And this really applies to politicians and academics and others who are supposed to be people with an accountability and a responsibility in society. And then you add to this, at the technological level and at the level of social media, all of this can apply to, they call it, for instance, the digital hive. The digital hive, that's a technological term for the echo chamber, that you are with a group of people and you only hear your thoughts and their thoughts, and they only hear their thoughts and yours, and that's it. And their thoughts match yours and yours match theirs. So there's nothing new happening here, but that's the same idea. The idea of what's happening with algorithms and algorithmic manipulation, right? So you are stuck seeing the world in a very specific way. And this leads to the next one, which is the false representation on social media. Because of the algorithms and because of who uses social media versus those who don't, it gives you the impression that, for instance, the majority or the crowd are all doing something, when it could in fact be 10% of the population. But on social media, it's 90% of what you see. So now suddenly it gives you a false sense of who is representative of the crowd, who is representative of the norm, which makes you behave in a certain way. If 90% of the people are doing this, maybe this is what I should also be doing. When in reality it's only 10 or 20%, because that's all you see, right? And that's part of all of that. And so in conclusion from all of this, you have groupthink, this idea of groupthink or crowd psychology, or they call it group mind. It's a real phenomenon. It's a real thing. And at the end, it reduces you as an individual. It reduces your individuality. It reduces your critical thinking, and it reduces your individual intelligence and wisdom and judgment. All of this needs to now be countered. Therefore, this is the segue, but I'll stop here. This was the segue to the next point, which is, now that we've criticized, we've shown that we can be very skeptical or even critical of experts and intellectuals in society, and we spent a lot of time on those. It wouldn't be a balanced discussion to also explain the other side. So we'll look at a couple of works, because I think the other side is a little bit more the intuitive side, the side that we all think should be the norm, but as we see, most of those who talk about the intellectuals and the experts, we're not really for, and we're not praising and glorifying the experts and the intellectuals. They were warning against. They were showing that we're going too far and we're following them too blindly, and so on and so forth. But we also have to balance the discussion by saying there are still voices. But as I said, to me at least, very clearly, there's a political dimension to this. And in reaction to a social reality, a lot of these works started to appear at the time of Trump and Brexit and COVID. And so they want to show that if the world is headed in a direction that we as experts and elites don't want, it's because we stopped listening to the experts and the elites who know better. And so the popular opinion and the masses are starting to take over and see the crisis and catastrophe that it is leading to. That's the main argument from these works. But all of this is, of course, presented as We have to go back to a world where we listen to the experts and we respect expertise, because expertise is dying. It is the end of expertise, or the death of expertise, as some books have been literally called. That's the title of the work, The Death of Expertise. Okay, so of course they describe why this is happening. In some cases it's just more descriptive, but in some cases it's a lot more normative or prescriptive. What do we need to do to go back to having societies that respect and give the right place to the experts and the intellectuals? Right? So inshallah we'll finish the discussion with that, and then we can turn our attention to, once we finish all of that, we go to the third theme that we have left, the trend from all of what we said we found in Western thinking about the role of the intellectual. The last theme that I wanted to talk about was the engagement. So all of this was about expertise, the intellectual as the expert. Inshallah, the next point is going to be the engagement of this intellectual, the engagement of this expert. Engagement as in, if I wanted to use another term, I would say, for instance, that they are an activist. That they act based on certain principles, and that it doesn't remain, their intellectual expertise and intellectual activity does not only remain at the level of the intellect, that they act in the world, that they take part of actions, that they are for causes and against other causes, and they do something about it. Right? That's what we mean by the engagement. And so we will see, as we said earlier, we will see how we will have all the extremes and everything in between. Those who say the intellectual must remain objective and neutral, give opinions, give theories, explain principles, but remain objective and never engage themselves directly into causes, on one extreme. And if they do, they are no longer an intellectual. And on the other extreme, they say that this is the absolute moral responsibility of the intellectual. And this comes back to the discussions about the power structures and who holds power and who best in society to understand those power structures and do something about them than the intellectual. Right? So inshallah we'll wrap up that discussion, and then we'll move on to seeing what the Islamic world and the Islamic thinkers have had to say about the intellectuals. And then we'll draw the parallels from all of that to see what we can use for our own communities of knowledge, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Questions? Anything for discussion? تفضلوا. Yeah, so it's a really good question, but I think I have to add a context to it. So the books that we are mentioning, we're trying to say there are thinkers who have thought about this, and the conclusion they reached is that it is better to be a generalist than a specialist, or at least earlier in life. We're not saying we agree with this, and we're not saying that this is what we want in our communities. We said we want to see in general what Western thinkers have reached as conclusions when they have looked at the intellectual. Until now, we haven't said where we think we need to go as a community. Inshallah, that will be the last part of the discussion. We're just trying to get as many thoughts and arguments as we can, because we said many are those who have thought about this issue. And this is not an issue, I'll be honest, this is one of the novel issues. This is not something that has existed since the time that, the Quran was revealed. This is a novel. This is a new question that arises for us as communities. So what we're trying to do, I'm doing it out loud, on how we should be thinking as communities and the way we do it. So where do we draw the arguments from, the points from? We go to all those who have thought about it. And of course, we're doing this in summary, and I'm just drawing kind of general conclusions. This would have to be done in more detail. But in general, we see everywhere we might find something relevant to our discussion. We put it all together. So now we're focusing on what the Western side has said. Then we will look at some of what the Islamic side has said, the Muslim thinkers, and their arguments and their conclusions. And then we'll take all of that and look at what applies to our situation as communities. And of course, we hope that our guide is the Holy Quran and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt. To what extent do these notions apply? To what extent this works or not for us as a community? It's an excellent question, and it should have been part of what we explained earlier, but we didn't. So that forced me. Thank you. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.